Sophia Fifner, thank you so much for joining us at Marsy's Law, Why We Do What We Do interview series. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I want to first introduce you to people who don't know you through all of your advocacy work in Ohio. It's really been amazing what you have done um, over the last several years now, not just for Marsy's Law, but throughout the victims' rights world in not just in Ohio but in the country. Um, for people who don't know Sophia yet, just by way of quick bio, um, Sophia is kind enough to serve on our board in Marsy's Law for Ohio Advisory Board. She also serves as the chair of the Ohio Crime Victim Justice Center. Been on the board there for a couple of years. Also serves on the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, part of the Speakers Bureau, and partners with the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network called RAIN. Is a member of the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, is currently the president and CEO of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. And a fun fact is Sophia is also the former Mrs. Ohio. I don't know if it's former or once you get the title, you get it forever. Mrs. Ohio and Mrs. United States from the United States national pageants. And most importantly is a mom as well. So Sophia, welcome. And I just want to kind of get right into it. Why we have these interview series is a lot of times we want to highlight the people who are in this space and what actually has motivated them to get into this important work of victims' rights and advocating for victims' rights and for survivors. There's some incredibly inspirational and empowering stories around the country, and yours is one of the most incredible ones that I've seen. So could you tell us a little bit about how you grew up first, and then we'll get into how you got into this work.
Sure. So I would say, one of the main reasons why I'm so passionate about Marsy's Law is that I am a survivor. I grew up in Pickerington, Ohio, which for those who aren't familiar with Ohio, especially in the 1980s, 90s, it was a relatively small suburb outside of Columbus. My parents immigrated to the United States, first to New York and then to Ohio, and landed in this community. And it was a loving community. It was the type of community where, as a kid, I rode my bike across town to visit my friends, to play Barbies all summer or Monopoly. We'd spend a lot of time at the pool. We didn't have Google and YouTube, so we spent a lot of time outside in the woods or in the creek just playing and feeling incredibly safe. And as a child, I would say that the adults in my life really cared for me. We were the type of family that went to church not only on Sunday morning, but Sunday afternoon, sometimes Sunday evenings, and definitely on Wednesdays. So I grew up in a loving community, a safe community, and one where I felt like I could be loved and heard and respected. It was just great. The things that really changed, though, was one night when I was invited to a party at a neighboring suburb. And I didn't know anybody at this event. I thought that it'd be a fun opportunity to spend some time with my friends in high school. I knew that there'd be older individuals there, but I didn't really think twice about attending. So I walked into this house, truly believing in the goodness of humanity and the safety of the communities that I had grown up with, and left completely alone in a dark basement, violated and completely engulfed with terror. What happened that night was I had drank an incredible amount and passed out in a basement. And I only woke up to someone attacking me. And, I left that home not quite knowing how to define that experience. But truthfully, by the grace of God, there was a friend of mine who I told shortly after, and she is the one that drove me to the hospital to complete a SANE kit. She is the one that helped me cope through this situation and told me that I was raped. But I did everything by the book, or that I thought I was supposed to do. I went to the hospital, I completed a SANE kit, and I filed a police report. And unfortunately, the events after that were what really transformed my life in really, really negative ways.
And this was the very next day that you went to the hospital, and the SANE report, that stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner's Report. Um, and I remember you telling me, well, first of all, you said you went to that party and you drank, and you said it was not necessarily something that was part of Sophia's house growing up. I think you said that your mom still had the same bottle of rum for the entire time that you've been alive, that she only uses to put in banana bread.
Yes, yeah. So my parents, as a kid, I grew up in a household where alcohol was not part of our culture. We really had one bottle of rum. And my mom, till this day, puts maybe a capful in her banana bread, and that's about it. So I didn't have exposure to drinking in my home. And, I definitely drank an incredible amount that night.
And when you woke up, I remember you telling me that you had um, that you felt disoriented, and you felt that you almost became disassociated with your own body, and it was like you said, through the incredible assistance of your friend who supported you and brought you the next day to the hospital, and then after that was when you got uh, kind of a dose of reality on how difficult the criminal justice system can be to navigate as a victim. Tell us
Yeah.
about what happened next.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for sharing, Peter. But yes, that experience of being raped was absolutely horrendous. I wish that on no one. And as a survivor, as I think about that experience, I could see what was happening, but I couldn't move my body. And I think oftentimes when people think about sexual assaults, they think about it in a very Hollywood or glamorized format that, it's behind an alley and somebody drags you behind a trash can and you're fighting for your life. But truly, I completely disassociated and froze. And I thought that that would be the worst experience of the entire assault. But truthfully, it was what happened afterwards. So after I filed a report with the police, which I didn't realize I had an option to file or not file, the police were there, and I felt that the only option I had was to file a report. The police called my parents a few days later and shared that the young man who assaulted me, well, he came from a really good family from a nice neighborhood, that they were hiring an attorney, and that their attorney advised him to not take a polygraph examination, but they recommended that I take a polygraph test. So my parents, dutifully following the advice that we received from police, they drove me to take a polygraph examination. And I remember walking into this building, and I'm just a child, but I remember how empty and cold this building was. And I remember it was a very large empty room. There was one chair, a table, and a polygraph test, and a woman who was standing above me. She was a state trooper. And she asked me to tell my story again. So I told her what happened. And after I concluded, she leaned back and told me that what happened to me was not rape, that she had woken up to plenty of men in college that she didn't know, and that I wasn't assaulted, and that I was lying. And that was that. And unless I changed my story, she wasn't going to pursue completing a polygraph test. And even at that young age, yes, I made a lot of decisions that night, but no one has the right to assault me. And I also knew that I wasn't lying and I wasn't going to change my story. But her lack of belief in me completely transformed my life for years. For 16 years, I blamed myself. And for 16 years, I thought that no one would believe me and there was no resources available to even help me. Because if the police don't believe you, why would a jury or a court system believe you?
And I remember you telling me that not being believed was worse than being raped, in a sense.
Yeah, it truly was. I think oftentimes with people who are not familiar with working with survivors of sexual assault, they go, oh, well, all they have to do is just report and navigate, the next steps through the criminal justice system. I'm sure it's very clear. And one step after another, they'll be believed and justice will be served. But what I realized at a very early age is how complex our criminal justice system truly is, and how the lack of understanding or even knowing what my rights were really prevented me from seeking justice in so many ways.
And so you said you lived with this for 16 years and struggled, and you went through a journey emotionally and psychologically and otherwise. And there were certain people and experiences along the way that helped to transform to where you are now, transform you to who you are now and where you are now. You, I remember you were telling me about somebody that you met when you were in Miami of Ohio, when you were talking about self-esteem. You wanted to try to see if you could organize something around campus that would focus on people's self-esteem. Tell us a little bit about that and where that led you.
Yeah. With survivors, I think that everyone's journey is like a thumbprint. It's a little different. Some individuals can choose to take paths that might be incredibly harmful, and others can choose other paths that, take them on this journey that's incredibly twisting and winding. For me, at the time, because I thought that this rape happened to me and it was my fault, I thought that perhaps if I would have just had a stronger sense of self-worth or stronger self-esteem, that perhaps I could have prevented something like this from happening. And now, knowing 20 years later that that's not the case, but at the time I thought that that was the right approach to stepping into my healing journey. So I attended Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and I wanted to start a women's group. And to start any college group, you oftentimes need an advisor. And I went to the women's center and said, I want to start this women's organization. That's great, but you really need an advisor. We highly recommend that you reach out to this woman in our library system. Her name is Jackie. And so I went to the basement of the King Library, which is the main library on Miami University's campus. And I'll never forget meeting Jackie. She is this very petite, older Southern woman who is incredibly religious. And she looked at me and I was telling her what I wanted to do. And she goes, girl, you don't need to start a student organization. You can compete in Miss America. And I thought she was absolutely insane for suggesting that I compete in a pageant. I never in my wildest dreams saw myself on stage. That was something that other people did. And so much so, I mean, my college essay to get into Miami was called Ugly Duckling. I really didn't think that that was a space where I belonged. But what I learned is, one, I took her advice. And what I learned was that pageants really helped me at a time that I needed to build up my self-confidence. It helped me understand how to communicate what I felt, what I was really passionate about. It opened doors that I wouldn't have ever dreamed of opening. For example, I had an opportunity to work with county commissioners on character education programs. It encouraged me, inspired me to take on internships and eventually work in Washington, D.C. But most importantly, it taught me the fundamentals of advocacy. And I wouldn't realize that this was important then, but looking back, it really helped me understand the building blocks of, if you want to see change, here's how to pass legislation. Here's how to communicate persuasively an idea or solution that you have. And for that, I'm forever grateful. And while I never won Miss Ohio or Miss DC, I realized that I definitely had the pageant bug, which is why I ended up competing in the Mrs. systems.
And in the Mrs. systems, you ultimately won Mrs.
Yes.
Ohio and Mrs. United States.
Yes, yes.
And if we could just touch a little bit upon your experience in Washington, D.C., because I think that's important, because you learned how to become an advocate, and a very successful advocate, through the pageants. And then as far as the practical experience of taking an idea or a policy issue, and we'll get to that, which is ultimately how you helped with Marsy's Law as well, and realizing the mechanics and the system that is so foreign to so many people, that your talents were able to take Marsy's Law and bring it to fruition in Ohio. You worked with Senator Voinovich,
Yes.
in Capitol Hill. And tell us a little bit about how that helped you to become such a strong advocate for victims' rights.
Yeah. I think oftentimes when people think of working on Capitol Hill, that I'm going to be really honest, that it's this horrendous place where things don't get done. Because oftentimes, if you watch the news, it's the pain points of legislation are often amplified. But what people don't see are the everyday, ordinary people who are passionate about a variety of issues that visit the Capitol or the local state offices of elected officials every single day, who are really impacting and influencing change. So while I was in DC, I think the best moment was, again, I think that there's this perception that if you are meeting with a senator, that you have to be the CEO of a major corporation or somebody incredibly influential. What I loved most was seeing my neighbor, ordinary Ohioans, call the senator's office, write letters to the senator, meet with myself and other staff members to advocate about issues that were really important to them. And those issues ranged from supporting public schools to healthcare solutions to technology. I mean, it ran the entire gamut. And what I realized is that, one, to be effective in moving legislation, one, it's incredibly important to speak up. Two, collaboration is always key. Building coalitions are so critical if you really want to influence change. And then the last part is you really need solutions that will meet the needs of the greater good, that include both Republican and Democratic ideals, if you really want a solution that's going to impact people in a positive way.
And at some point, you said you also wanted to see if you could make space for diverse voices and see if you could unite around a common cause. And one of the things and one of the issues which came naturally to you as a survivor through your healing journey, you got to the point where one of these policy areas was victims' rights, and you started. I think the name of it was a Salon Lab that you told me about. And one of the first unifying issues was victims' rights in Ohio, because it happened to be the time that Marsy's law in 2017 was on the ballot to get passed in the state of Ohio. So
Yeah.
tell me about that, and then how you went from there to getting legislation passed ultimately recently in Ohio.
Yeah. So let me give some context. So the 2016 election, I think that many people across the United States can agree that there were a lot of conversations being surfaced to the table. And I really, as somebody who worked in a Republican administration and in a Republican office, I wanted to understand my neighbors. I wanted to understand their perspectives on issues from everything regarding gun rights or gun control or climate change. I wanted to have a space where we could have those conversations. So I met a woman who's now my best friend, who also loved to talk about politics. She identified as a Democrat and I identified as a Republican at the time. And we were like, we need to continue this conversation. So let's start a book club with no books and just talk about politics, current events, and lots of wine. And let's just invite anybody and everybody to this event or this gathering and see who shows up. And I'm pretty confident, and actually I've spoken to law enforcement and they would probably agree that this was not the best idea, but I posted on Facebook, and women showed up from all over Central Ohio to my living room. And the first meeting we had was about Marsy's law. And the premise of these meetings were, we didn't have a subject matter expert give a speech about the issue. We each did our research to try to understand the constitutional amendment that was on the ballot that overwhelmingly passed in the state of Ohio, and bring our perspectives. And that was truly my first introduction to Marsy's law. It helped me understand, wow, with my experience as a survivor of rape, I really did not understand what rights I had and what rights I had access to. I had no idea. And it was the spark that really ignited my passion for supporting Marsy's law today. You mentioned the legislation that was recently passed. here in Ohio. Marsy's law is a constitutional amendment, was the people's voice here in Ohio. Over 80% of Ohioans supported this constitutional amendment to ensure that crime victims had the same rights as the accused and convicted, nothing more and nothing less. However, in Ohio, we didn't really have a good framework to make sure that every facet of the criminal justice system could work together to actually support this constitutional amendment. So I partnered with organizations like the Ohio Crime Victims Justice Center and Representative White to make sure that we had a good framework in place to have the guidelines and funding needed to make sure that this constitutional amendment could actually be put into place and enacted. And I'm so thankful that we were able to do that. The bill passed in December and was enacted in April.
And this is State Representative Andrea White.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and Kathy Harper Lee, who is one of really the heroes of the victims' rights movement, not just in Ohio but around the country.
Oh my gosh. I mean, for anyone who's watching Facebook Live, if you do not know Kathy Harper Lee's story, she's the founder of the Ohio Crime Victims Justice Center. Please look her up. That we would not be where we are in Ohio. There's many voices that have come to the table to support victims' rights, but Kathy has been at the forefront for over 20 years. So I'm just happy that I could meet her, know her, and work with her in advocating for other victims.
Yeah, and like you said, one of the misconceptions sometimes when we are introducing Marsy's law into a state is the people on the defense side think that maybe viewing victims' rights or constitutional rights, I should say, as a zero-sum game. If you're giving victims constitutional rights, that you would be necessarily taking away constitutional rights of defendants, but that's not the case at all. And so one of the things that we talk about in Marsy's law is that victim rights, and that this is the way that it is in Ohio, shall be upheld in a manner no less vigorous than the rights of the accused.
Yes, 100%. And I, as a victim and survivor, I can't tell you how challenging it is to even know what your rights are. Right? When something traumatic happens to you, no one wakes up and goes, geez, this big thing's going to happen to me. And I know exactly every single step I need to take to navigate the criminal justice system to make sure that my voice is heard and that my rights are protected. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Marsy's law and why I feel so strongly that it should be enshrined in constitutions, because unfortunately, a lot of terrible things happen to individuals, good people, every single day. But trying to make sure that those rights are upheld for them is incredibly challenging unless you have a constitutional amendment and legislation that really supports and provides a framework so every facet of the criminal justice system knows how to work together to make sure that people's rights are protected.
Yeah, and that's why this is, and that was a really good explanation. That's why this legislation is so important in Ohio, that it enables all the different parts of the criminal justice system to work together, but also to be aware that this House bill that was just passed, that victims now know their rights, but it also informs people across the system, prosecutors, defense, the courts, custodial facilities, of what the victims are looking for and what kind of rights the victims are afforded in constitutional rights, and also gives the victims at their earliest contact in the criminal justice system, gives them this information sheet that they can look at their earliest contact, which reminded me of what you were talking about when you had to navigate the criminal justice system, which was completely different.
Yeah. What's great about House Bill 343 here in Ohio is that part of that legislation is to produce a victim's rights request form, which means that once you report the crime that has happened to you, you'll have a form. In Ohio Crime Victims Justice Center has a 2-page form that you can literally just check mark. Here are all of the rights that I should understand or have access to or opt into. And then more importantly, for the state of Ohio and residents here Ohio Crime Victims Justice Center also has a victims' rights toolkit, which is an online database for victims to go into and understand, okay, I'm here at this process, at this court system. Here's the steps that I need to take, or it'll guide you through the entire criminal justice process and helping you understand what steps you should be taking or can be taking. And this is important because, especially for survivors of anything related to sex trafficking or sex crimes, oftentimes there's an incredible amount of nuances that most people wouldn't know or have access to. And in my own case, I grew up in a community where my mother's a nurse. My neighbor friend down the street, her father was a postal worker. I had an electrician who lived across the street. I honestly, I was trying to think, I don't think I knew anyone who was a doctor or an attorney or who had the financial means or the family relationships to access an attorney that would be able to help me. And what's great about this, Marsy's Law specifically, is I feel it's a great equalizer in really helping individuals who come from all different backgrounds understand and comprehend their rights.
Well, and I've seen that you have actually described Marsy's Law, and as someone who is a fighter for equity like you've described Marsy's Law as equity realized.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that you mentioned about the criminal justice system, and it's not as if people wake up and say, okay, today is the day that I'm going to have to navigate the criminal justice system because something terrible is about to happen to me. You just don't know. The two systems that we talked about is the legislative system that you were able to learn on Capitol Hill, and then sadly the criminal justice system that was thrust upon you, and you had to learn that on your own, and now you know it, sadly, as an expert from personal experience. But they're two different systems to the extent that there's something intentional about becoming involved in the legislative process and going to Washington, D.C., like you said, whether it's a neighbor or someone else who is going to try to advance a policy issue. But the criminal justice system, to be thrust into it like you were, and like anybody is, the way that you just described it as a thumbprint, everyone's case is different. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for people to realize, because so many times, especially in the case of sexual assault and Sexual Assault Awareness Month, when people say, well, as a victim, why didn't the victim do this? Why didn't they do that? Why didn't they call? Why did they wait so long? Because there is no blueprint.
No.
Every case is different. Like you said, it's more like a thumbprint or a fingerprint. And I think that's really an incredible analogy. And it really holds true.
Yeah, Peter, especially, geez, for individuals with developmental disabilities, if you have a language barrier, as many, especially those in Central Ohio, might have when approaching the Criminal Justice Center, there are so many steps that you have access to or should have access to. And that's why I'm really excited about the Victims' Rights Request Form, because at least you'll have everything you need in one space. And with Marsy's Law, again, I just truly feel it's a great equalizer for victims everywhere, because it really helps level the playing system and give you a framework to at least begin or to start that journey. For me, we just took the police for their word. They told me, I don't believe you. I didn't know I could do anything else. The police officers recommended a polygraph. I didn't even know that was a law that had passed a year prior that was not recommended, that shouldn't have happened. So I'm just really thankful for the work that Marsy's Law has been able to accomplish here in Ohio. But more importantly, I'm just thankful for the overwhelming majority of Ohioans that will now have this really great framework and access to their own rights in a meaningful way.
And it's so important that we have people like you and spokespersons and such effective advocates like yourself, because for you to go out and be as selfless as you are, because I've heard you in interviews say that although you can't rewrite or change your story, that it's easier for you to sleep at night knowing that victims and future victims, when and if they become involved in the criminal justice system to tell their story, that they are empowered and that they know that they have constitutional rights as victims. And as part of part of National Crime Victims' Rights Week, Marsy's Law, as you and I know have been lighting up landmarks all around the country in purple in recognition of Victims' Rights Week. And in Ohio, there have been a couple of landmarks. I know the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think you said the Dublin Bridge, and then
Mhm.
tonight the Terminal Tower in Cleveland is going to be lit up. So I think I'd like people to look out for that, um, which kind of tells the story and kind of it just lets people know far and wide. I think if you go up to the observation deck and Terminal Tower, I think you can see for 30, 40 miles, just to show people far and wide how important this work is. Um, I think it's important when we look back. I just look back as far as a metaphor goes. When you talked about that empty and cold room that you described when you were a little girl, and you were first introduced to the criminal justice system, and that memory seared clearly in your head of an empty and cold room. And I think that might be somewhat symbolic of the fact that without constitutional rights for victims, or without victims knowing their rights, like you didn't know back then, and that
Mhm.
was in Ohio before Marsy's Law even and came to be in Ohio, that we no longer want people to feel either literally or figuratively like they're in an
Yeah.
empty, cold room. We'd like them to know that they're in a place, literally and figuratively, where they are supported, where it's warm, and where they're going to have the help that they need.
Yeah. I've worked, whether it be, in government relations or philanthropy, or, doing advocacy work for issues that are really critical for survivors of sexual assault and violent crimes. And what I've realized is that overwhelmingly, the people who work in the criminal justice system, police officers, law enforcement, prosecutors, they care deeply about their work. I unfortunately encountered some bad apples, right? But overwhelmingly, people really care and want to do the right thing. And I'm so incredibly thankful for this movement around Marsy's Law, because it's helping these really big complex systems. It's helping us navigate how to do the right thing even better, and how to make sure that everyone, even if you're a small town girl from Ohio, that you can understand your rights and know how to take the next step forward to whatever your healing journey is.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being such a powerful voice for victims and for survivors, and for sharing your story, and for sharing your healing journey, which I know continues. Um,
Thank you.
and thank you for continuing to work with us at Marcy's Law too. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Sophia.